Please welcome the panel on Creating a Cleaner Future, moderated by Gillian Tett, chair of the editorial board and editor-at-large of U.S. at the Financial Times.
Oh, goodness me. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to a panel that I hope is going to provide a bit of optimism and cheer at a time of great uncertainty and turbulence. We're talking about efforts to combat climate change and the surprising champions that are emerging in that respect as we undergo significant changes in geopolitics, I guess one can say. I've been looking at this issue now for about a decade. Some of you may know I created the platform Moral Money at the Financial Times a few years ago to try and look at the battle against climate change and how business and finance are playing that role. I always suspected there would be a backlash after the hype a few years ago. I didn't expect the scale of backlash, but we are now living through it. I'm a great believer, though, in the pendulum theory, pendulum swing theory of history, and the fact that there are many people who, amid all the political rhetoric, are fighting loyally and consistently and sometimes effectively to combat these negativity. So we have two fantastic people to talk about this today. Simon Stiell, who's the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. He's been at the center of this battle for a long time. And Majid Al Suwaidi, who's the CEO of Altérra, which is a fund established by the UAE after the COP meetings and is now, I believe, the largest single fund dedicated to investing in green solutions and climate tech. Not something many people would have predicted a decade ago, but it shows how the world can change. And so both of you are really displaying great leadership at this time in this respect. So I'd like to start perhaps with you, Simon, and ask you, when you look at the climate change battle today, 3-4 years ago, everybody seemed to be on board. Now we have a lot of backsliding in the West, not so much in places like the Middle East, but in the West. Are you feeling discouraged and depressed? Can we still keep 1.5 alive as the tag goes in terms of limiting global warming to under 1.5 degrees of the pre-industrial average?
Thank you, Gillian. There's no debating that the transition is difficult. It is challenging, and these are particularly challenging geopolitical times. So in terms of, let's start with the negative. If we look at the speed of climate change and the impacts that's having every region, every country, every community around the world. It's no longer something that's abstract. It's no longer something that's just impacting the most vulnerable parts of the world. It's impacting everyone, and we're more relevant than here in the state of California in terms of the state's experiences with wildfires, climate exacerbated at the beginning of this year. So the rate of climate impacts and the impact that's having on ordinary people, on economies all over the world, gives one cause for great concern. Now the positive. Looking at where we are in terms of progress being made, albeit not fast enough. If we look at where we were before the Paris Agreement 10 years ago, the world was on a 5 degrees warming trajectory. Based on the Paris Agreement, the process, where we stand right now, based on the commitments countries have made, we're on roughly a 3-degree trajectory. At the end of this year, we will tally, based on the next round, the new round of climate commitments from countries, we'll see where we are. But the needle will have moved further, closer to that 2-degree, closer to that 1.5 degree target. So progress, the process is working. But as said, it's subject to countries fulfilling those commitments. But based on that, I believe there is cause for optimism.
Right. And before I turn to Majid Al Suwaidi, how much damage has the shift in US position done in the battle? Because, going from a world where President Joe Biden was essentially championing the IRA and, showing leadership on the world stage, to a world where essentially the current US administration appears to be intent on ripping up many of the agreements and essentially scoffing at the urgency. Is that something that you think can be worked around? How concerned are you about that?
Well, it's clear that the US's withdrawal from the Paris Agreement has some significance, but there are 194 countries still within the Paris Agreement and committed to the goals of the Paris Agreement. So, cause for concern, yes, but the signal that's come from many other significant players is that commitment. So when a void is created, others will fill that void, that vacuum. And we see clear leadership from other significant economies around the world, as well as commitments from developed countries. So we will see how that is reflected with respect to the climate plans that countries put forward at the end of this year. But certainly the signals that are being given by others is they see the economic opportunities for climate action, and the climate agenda, the decarbonization agenda is already locked in to many economies, many major economies around the world. So regardless what happens here in the United States, others are moving forward and will reap the benefits of that.
Right. Well, one of those others which is moving forward is the UAE, which, I'll be honest with you, it was not on my dance card 10 years ago that the UAE would be in the position of having the largest climate tech fund. So tell us quickly what you're doing with the 30 billion that you have earmarked for this climate tech fund, because that is a lot of money.
Well, Gillian, I think you're right. A lot of people didn't expect that the UAE would be investing so much, but actually people who know the UAE, who've been, who've visited, who've known our track record, know how committed our government has been. We hosted COP28 two years ago now with Simon. It was one of the most successful COPs that has been in recent times. And at that COP, we wanted to show practically how we could get back on track to achieving 1.5, how we could be doing real pragmatic, practical things that would got us there. I was Director General for a COP and worked with our COP president. We traveled around the world, and time again, what we heard was that we needed to have more finance, and particularly more finance flows to the global south. And so from that, our president launched our fund, the Altérra fund, which is a 30 billion fund. We have our acceleration, 25 billion that can invest anywhere in the world, and then 5 billion that's committed for the global south. This really speaks to the sort of journey that the UAE's been on for about 20 years. Today, Masdar was created 20 years ago. Today, one of the largest renewable energy firms globally. And it's part of our economic diversification story, part of the UAE's development story. And climate change is really at the heart of what the UAE government has been focused on. And so Altérra is an extension of that. It also is the fact that we see a moment where there's an opportunity for investment, particularly in renewables, around industrial decarbonization, around climate tech, but also around the general sustainableness, living space, adaptation, agriculture, water, that it's no longer something that is a nice to have, but actually something that makes economic and financial sense and is an investment opportunity. And that's why we are so committed as a fund, and we've committed about 6.5 through our partners, BlackRock, TPG, and Brookfield. We've invested across 7 different strategies, some of them they're existing strategies, but what we get most excited about is we've created these 2 new strategies with Brookfield and TPG, Brookfield's CTF fund and TPG's GSI, Global South Initiative. And they have gone out, we seeded with capital. They've gone out and raised against that. They've been brilliant at raising, about 4 to 9 times raised on the capital. And so that shows that there's an appetite, that people want to invest in this space. But these funds are global south focused, and they're starting to deploy that capital on the ground into real investments that will make a difference in tackling climate change in a very practical and pragmatic way.
To what degree are you seeking to try and work with the multilateral development banks in forms of blended finance? Because Ajay Banga, for example, has been talking a lot about trying to use much more innovative structures to unlock this global finance, particularly for the global south, and talking about trying to, maybe the World Bank can take the junior position in terms of the risk tranches and try and unlock positions for people like yourselves in the mezzanine tranches. Is that something that you see as a future right now?
I think that we have had a wonderful relationship with Ajay Banga. I know that he was very involved with us at COP, and we've had a lot of conversations with him and his team about how we can do blended finance and do it well. In our journey, we started out with the private sector. So how could we move those large GPs to thinking about investing more in climate and then specifically in the global south? And the other piece of it is, as you say, to bring in the development finance. When we were designing Altérra, we really spent a lot of time thinking about how could we create a fund or an organization that wasn't just repeating what had been done before. And what we saw was that there was a lot of concessional capital out there. There was a lot of private capital out there, but there wasn't that bridge between that could create sort of blended solutions, right? And that's where Altérra was born. So we see ourselves working in that space. I think that the journey with development finance is maybe going to take a bit longer than we expected, but we've been so surprised at the work we've done with private capital, so we feel really optimistic about the path forward. And sometimes that's about the speed at which we can operate versus the speed that they can operate. But we definitely need to see more from our international financial institutions. We need to see the World Bank taking a greater risk position, helping the private sector to manage that risk in more effective ways. And that's where I think Ajay can be a real leader and has been in this space and can come up with some really interesting ideas.
I mean, one thing I'd like to ask both of you is that much of the investment focus until now has been on mitigation efforts, which clearly are not of a scale that they're actually managing to keep the temperature within the right range. Is it time to recognize reality and focus more on adaptation?
I think in a nutshell it's both. So you have, in terms of the long-term fixes are through accelerated action implementation on the mitigation front. That is the only way in which we're going to bring down the emissions. But in the meantime, we're seeing the impacts of climate change accelerating, and the need for countries to embrace what they need to do to adapt to it, and some countries more than others, it is there too. So it's not an either-or, it is both. And we've seen those countries, most in the global south, those that are most vulnerable, those that the impact mitigation action has in terms of reducing overall global emissions is minimal. They are the ones who are actually on the front lines of climate change. They are the ones who need the resources most at this time to adapt to, whether it's rising sea levels, whether it's impacts of storms, floods, etc. So that adaptation agenda needs to accelerate also. And the less that we mitigate is the more that we're not only going to have to adapt to, but it's also loss and damage, which is the third pillar. So action is required on all three fronts, which is why that basic message of accelerated action in all areas is now. And coming back to your opening statement with regard to keeping 1.5 alive, The science tells us clearly it is still there. Yes, we may have breached in a single year, but it's a long-term target. But the need for us to pick up our pace to ensure that we hit that target is still there.
Right. I mean, are you mostly focusing on mitigation investments, or are you doing adaptation as well? Because that has been a lot less developed in terms of investment opportunities.
I think the great thing about us at Altérra is that we think about what we can do today and what we can invest in today. And I would say that the mitigation space is definitely much more mature than the adaptation space. So that's where the bulk of our capital is going. But we have increasingly started to look at how can we be investing in adaptation. I think the thing that for me about how we think about it is at COP28, and part of the reason we launched Altérra amongst other solutions is we felt that it was really important to change the narrative around climate. For so long, we've had a narrative that this is a space where we're going to reduce people's prosperity. We're going to take away energy from them. We're going to reduce their development opportunity. And I think that has really changed since COP28. And at Altérra, what we are talking about is what can we be giving people rather than what can we be taking away? How can we be investing in solutions that can scale and provide clean energy to people at the same cost that they can of conventional energy? How can we be providing mitigation solutions or climate tech solutions that help them with energy efficiency in their home? And by the way, that helps them save money on their pocketbooks at the end of the month. How can we be helping them to create adaptation solutions that help them, live a more comfortable life in a changing environment? So I think that what's really good about what has changed a lot is that we're now looking at this as an opportunity. We're looking at this as a positive, and our investments really show that there is a pipeline and there's an appetite, and we have many, many partners who want to work with us to be investing more in this space.
And I have to ask, because we are an investment conference, what kind of returns are you looking for?
Well, we're largely an infrastructure fund, so we look like infrastructure-type returns.
Right.
But we don't think in that way. So what's really unique, I think, about Altérra is we kind of have this dual mandate. One is to be commercial, and that was on purpose because we wanted to make sure we were investing in things that were scalable and that made economic sense. But the other part is that we need to have impact, and our impact is measured in multiple ways. One, in emissions reductions, how are we helping to solve the climate crisis? But the second part is in mobilization of capital. So we have a sort of top-line goal to use our capital to mobilize $250 billion from our $30 billion, and that's
a lot of leverage.
But we are extremely confident that we can make that. In fact, those are our conservative estimates of what we can do. So I think that's what makes us feel really excited, is when we can find those opportunities where we can both invest capital and make good returns, but we can also show that we can have great impact for the global south, but also globally for tackling climate change.
Right. And you are very quickly, you are finding places to deploy that money, because some of the reporting suggested that, in fact, it's hard to find places right now to actually invest.
No, we are overwhelmed with the pipeline of projects actually to invest in. So it's really about selecting the things that make sense for our portfolio, for our priorities, that we're getting maximum impact for every dollar that we spend. I think that what's been really exciting about us is, you talked about blended finance. We've been creating these interesting vehicles with Brookfield and TPG, where we've brought in capital that was first in kind of capped out model. We've been trying different models to bring in other capital. Because we have this goal of working with partners to mobilize more capital, that's what we are always looking at, is how is every one of our dollar having maximum impact and maximum return. And so the pipeline is there. We are overwhelmed with projects that we can invest in. So frankly, we know that energy is going to double between now and 2050. This is an economic opportunity that we are running behind to catch up on, rather than looking for things to invest in.
Well, thank you very much indeed. We are sadly out of time. I'll just say I found this fascinating. I guess my key takeaways are that, one, in spite of all the incredibly negative political rhetoric, which the media and others tend to pick up on, there is still a lot of action happening behind the scenes, slowly and steadily, In some ways, the very fact there's such a backlash means it's really the committed who are still forging ahead. Secondly, it's very encouraging to hear that innovative ways of financing this and creating financial structures are occurring, because that is exactly what's needed. I've often said that blended finance is a bit like the spinach of the global financial system. Everyone knows it's good for you, but no one actually wants to eat it most of the time or actually do it. But you are actually pushing ahead with, if not spinach, then interesting models. And thirdly, at a time when it's very fashionable to be gloomy, you still believe that 1.5 is not dead, not quite alive yet, but certainly still alive in hope and aspiration. So let's all hang on to that hope and aspiration. And thank you, both of you, very much indeed, both for what you're doing, for appearing on the platform, explaining it, and to the audience for coming along today. So thank you very much indeed. Best of luck.
Thank you.